So now we're going to take a closer look at the timeline panel. If we sort of pick up where we left off with our composition here, we have steps that has the radial blur applied, and I'm just going to scroll down so it comes more into the screen here. And one of the things that sometimes we want to be able to do is make some modifications to the way that the effect is applied, but not have to look at it all the time. And sometimes it can be visually distracting, but other times it can take up some valuable render time or preview time when we're looking at our footage. We're basically working with still images right now so that things are a little bit quicker. A lot of these little elements would take a lot more time to preview if we were working with video. So we're kind of working with still images for that reason. But I want to bring your attention to over here on the far left hand side of my radial blur effect in steps, we have an FX icon. And it's in the same column as my visibility icon for my each of my individual layers. And so if I click on that, what that does is it doesn't delete the effect from that particular layer, but it makes it so that that effect is no longer visible. And so sometimes that can be a great help. So I just want to point that out to you there. So if we want it back on, we can do that. If we want it off, we can do that. Okay. So we will sort of tighten that up there. And now what I want to do is just kind of give you a little bit of a tour of our timeline panel here. The timeline panel is what we're going to use when we animate layer properties. This is where we're going to set in and out points for a particular layer. If you're not familiar with what in and out points are, it's basically when a element starts in the sequence and when an element ends. So we can select some different values for those as we go. A lot of the timeline panels are organized in ways that make sense, but sometimes things are a little bit hard to find. So we've got a lot of columns and a lot of different icons here, so we want to make sure to introduce you to them. The first thing we'll look at is the composition name, and that is located up here. It's steps 3, and you can see we can have multiple compositions open within the same project and not have any kind of conflict there. And that's nice because sometimes we work back and forth from one composition to another. Sometimes we nest one composition inside another composition. We'll talk more about that as we go, but when we talk about nesting sequences or nesting compositions, that's what we're talking about. Excuse me. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the idea of the current time, and that's located over here. And we mentioned the idea of frames per second, or FPS, when we talked about setting up the composition, but this is basically our placement of our playhead in the overall composition. And you can see that we get the little resize arrow if we click and drag. So if I want to see what's exactly happening at the 10-second mark, we can go 10 seconds. This is our frames, seconds, minutes, and hours. And we'll talk more about time code and frames per second as we go. But this is where current time is located, and it's basically giving us the numerical equivalent of the placement of the playhead in the composition. It's also reflecting whatever's happening up here. So the composition is tied to our timeline in that whatever is visible in our composition is because of where the playhead is located. The next thing that we'll take a look at is our time graph, or our graph editor area. And in this particular display, this is our time graph. If we click on this little icon here for graph editor, then we get a different kind of viewpoint here. And the graph editor is going to come into play when we get into some more sophisticated and advanced kinds of effects. So we'll certainly talk about it, but for now you should probably have it so that it just shows the time graph, giving us the access to the individual layers and some of the different kinds of things that we're able to control with them. We have our audio and video switches that are available over here. We have some different sort of ways that we can control what's happening. Right now there's nothing in our audio element because we don't have any audio files here. This red lights is an audio file, and if I drag it down, you can see that the little icon for my audio does pop up there. If I deselect this, that means that even if it plays, this particular element will not be heard. So if I need to mute the file, I can do it that way. So if we want to take a look at what each of these switches are and what each of these icons are, we have the video, and this is if we want to hide the visibility, we can do that. We've done that already. This is our audio, and if we want to mute or make something audible, we can do it there. This next one is a solo button, and what that does is it hides all non-solo video, and it's going to let us target something specific in the composition if we want to make a modification to something without having to look at everything else that's happening. Then this solo button can be really useful, and you can see that we can actually have multiple pieces in our solo. And in this particular sequence, not that important because there's not a lot of visual things that are going on, but as we get into more complicated sequences, you'll see where that's important. And we've already talked a little bit about the lock. This is what prevents the layer from being edited. So for example here, if I tried to change the position of something, it's not going to let me because it's locked. And again, when we're getting into more complicated compositions, then that locking feature is going to be really key. The next thing that we'll talk about is our source name or our layer name. We've already talked about how we can change that and how we can modify it, but just to sort of reinforce that kind of comment here. And then as we get over here, what we're talking about are our layer switches. And these are going to be really important as we start to get into some of the more complicated ways that we can modify each of these individual layers and how they can work with each other, how they preview some of the different properties that can be added or subtracted from them. And we'll talk a lot more about these as we go. Now, to get a little bit more specific with respect to our time graph that we have over here, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is the time ruler that we have up here at the top. We've mentioned before that this sequence is 30 seconds long, and you can see that we have different ticks for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15, and so on. We can zoom in or out. If we zoom in, you can see that it increases the number, and so now we can see the 4 second, the 6 second, the 8 second, and we can drag our playhead through that composition as we go. We also, as we zoom in, we're no longer able to see the entire composition within our time graph window here, so we can use this slider to move forwards and backwards as we like. And to give you a little bit more information about just what everything is called here, up at the top we have what's called the Time Navigator bar. And we have the start and we have the end bracket. And what this does is it shows us basically the location of our playhead. You can see here the little red vertical line within the overall sequence here. And so if I want to navigate through my sequence this way, this is one way to do it. And as I zoom in, you can see that that time navigator narrows up. But it's one way to move through the sequence and kind of see where you're going. The other way is to move this way, and you can see that they work in tandem with each other. So lots of different ways to do pretty much exactly the same thing. So the next thing that I want to bring your attention to is my work area. And the work area is the second bar here in my time ruler. And we have a start and we have a finish. And the work area is going to be something that you use when you want to target your attention and your computer's resources to a very specific portion of your composition. And we'll talk more about this as we go. But before we get too deeply into the animation element, we want to make sure you know what's going on here. This can also be clicked and dragged to different areas. It's going to be especially important when we start to talk about our RAM previews. The next thing that I want to bring your attention to is our timeline panel menu, and that's up here in the upper right hand corner. And much like all the other Adobe softwares, you've got some different kinds of things that can happen up here, and we'll talk more about them as we go. If you need different columns, then you can click on them here. You can see that these are the different ones that our current timeline is showing. We can also go to composition settings from here. We can do some different sort of things in terms of maximizing maximizing or changing the orientation of our workspace. But just so that you know it's there, it's a nice thing to have access to if you need it. The next thing that I want to draw your attention to is our composition marker bin. And that is this little element over here. This icon is the same icon that we use for markers in some of the other Adobe software. And a marker is used to make a specific notation at a particular moment in time. And so if I know that, say at the 10-second mark, this is where I want something specific to happen, I can click on this and bring it over here and create a specific marker for my piece of information. And we'll talk more about markers as we go, but just so that you know what these different icons are. We talked about the way that you can change the sort of zoom on the timeline. This is actually called the time zoom slider. But you can see we've got the icon, the small little mountains, and then the big little mountains. So see everything from kind of far away, or if we want to zoom in and see something up close. So some different kinds of things that you can do there. The next thing that I'll draw your attention to is the composition button, and again, this is just some of the minutia of After Effects, but what this does is it brings forward the composition in whatever view we're looking at. So for example, if we wanted to target a specific layer, if we double click on the layer, it opens up as a individual element up here in what was my composition window and now is my layer window. And sometimes we want to do this, sometimes it happens by accident though. If we accidentally open up an individual layer and we want to get back to the composition, we can click here in this tab to bring back the composition, or we can use the composition button there that brings the composition forward. So again, you know, in all of these different programs, they're going to give you multiple ways to do the same thing, and so it's just a matter of keeping track of what's happening where, and understanding what works best for you and your workflow.